Love it or hate it, Steven Universe is a phenomenon. And in spite of its occasional missteps, it has some truly phenomenal episodes. Here's a look at my personal list of the top 10 best Steven Universe episodes. Just as an obligatory heads up, this list will contain spoilers. If you're not all the way caught up, it's probably best to not venture any further. But that out of the way, let's get started. Number 10, Sadie Killer. So, I'm starting this list off with a lower tier of favorite, but it's one that I like a lot. Steven Universe is often criticized for having too many towny-centric episodes, and while I understand why they frustrate people, certainly, I also understand why they're necessary. But that's a topic for another day. I love Sadie Killer so much because of the turning point it represents for Sadie as a character. She's been put through so much. Her job, her mother, her complicated relationship with Lars, and she finally has an outlet for all the frustration and anger she's built up over the years. Not to mention, I completely adore the horror aesthetic of the music that they go with. Number 9. Lars of the Stars / Jungle Moon. This is a two-parter that barely feels like one. Well connected, these two episodes are also very self-contained. Though we were introduced to the off-colors once before, this is where we really get to see them shine. They are, conceptually, an amazing idea for a team. A group of misfit gem space pirates out there sticking it to Homeworld? Sign me up to see more of that. The way the episode just drops the viewer in as soon as Steven and Connie pop in is a super clever way of getting all the exposition out of the way in a manner that's a fun and entertaining way to show off a big cast. Jungle Moon, however, is almost the opposite. It's an isolated story from exclusively Stevani's perspective. Interesting bit of trivia, this is the first episode that technically does not have Steven in it, as he remains fused with Connie the entire time. I kind of have a particular interest in survival stories, and this is a great take on one. Not to mention the incredible surreal dream sequence in which we get the first look at Pink Diamond is presented in an incredible way that preserves the reveal made in a single pale rose. Very well done. Number 8. The Answer. This flashback episode tells the story of Ruby and Sapphire in a beautiful way. The unique aesthetics of these flashback episodes narrated by Garnet are a huge selling point and really makes the episode stand out against others. There's honestly not a ton I can say about what makes this episode so good, as much of it is in the visual presentation, and I don't simply want to resort to summarizing the plot, as doing so would be an injustice to the episode. Sorry if this seems lazy, but I think this is one that's best done by going to watch it yourself. Number 7. Log Date 7152. This episode makes the list because it's one of the few times we really get to see the perspective of a character other than Steven. Getting to see Peridot adjusting to her new life and new surroundings immediately after forsaking her entire previous existence makes this one of the strongest character-driven episodes in the series. That aside, personally, this episode changed how I felt. Prior to this, I thought Peridot was fine, but she was often too abrasive for me to feel really attached to. Plus, I was always concerned that she was going to betray the team. But once I saw this episode, I was convinced that Peridot would be a new, loyal part of the Crystal Gems. Not to mention, a lot of Peridot's antics from a lack of understanding Earth culture in this episode are genuinely funny. And speaking of... Number 6. Hit the Diamond. Now, some of you might think that this is a weird pick, but I included it in this list for a pretty straightforward reason. I think it's the funniest episode. Despite Steven Universe often being a genuinely funny cartoon, the humor of the show is hardly ever talked about in fan communities, at least in my experience. I mean, a lot of the episode's humor comes from how stupid the Rubies are, but Steven, Peridot, Ruby and Sapphire, Amethyst, and even Lapis have hilarious moments in this episode. Not only that, this episode is one of the few that shows off most of the principal cast very well. Pretty much every member of the main cast gets a moment to take the spotlight. It's an episode I don't think I could ever get tired of watching. Number 5. Off-Colors / Lars's Head. So this two-parter rates on the list because of how absolutely unexpected everything in it was. First of all, this is the very first time we actually see Homeworld, something that I think took a lot of fans by surprise. Although we don't see very much of it, it definitely represents a benchmark moment for the show's canon. Secondly, we get an entire new cast of friendly characters all at once, ones whose stories I'm definitely interested in hearing about. As I mentioned regarding Lars of the Stars, I think the off-colors form a conceptually amazing cast of characters. Thirdly, the death and resurrection of Lars, plus figuring out the origins of Lion by proxy, is something that I'm sure absolutely no one was anticipating going into this episode. And not only that, Lars going from the intolerable teenage angst machine that he was to a character with respect and noble ambitions was an extremely welcome change. This is definitely one of the staple episodes of the show from here on out. Number 4. A Single Pale Rose. Okay, let me get the elephant in the room out of the way first. Yes, this is the episode that had the absolutely bananas reveal that Rose Quartz was actually Pink Diamond. That alone might warrant it for inclusion on the list of Best Steven Universe episodes, but let's take that out of the equation for a moment. Even without the big reveal, this episode is amazingly constructed. The symbolism of the way Steven has to go through layer after layer of Pearl's psyche to find the answers he was looking for is absolutely brilliant. Pearl is one of the most emotionally complex characters in this show, and the way she compartmentalizes things is shown off magnificently here. Not only that, the way that a Pearl deep within her subconscious stole the phone in order to tell Steven the truth, and yet the surface level Pearl is completely unaware of this, just goes to show how deeply buried in her mind the truth really was. So I think, even without the Rose Quartz reveal, the remarkably clever way this episode was presented is enough for it to rank as one of the all-time greats. Number 3. Jailbreak. This is the episode where Steven Universe goes from good to great. Again, this is an episode with another huge reveal, the fact that Garnet is a fusion. This revelation was the turning point that leads to the realization that there's much more to this show than met the eye. Not only that, this episode is the one that put the show on a lot of people's radar. Before this episode, I'd heard of the show in passing, but the day after this episode premiered, cartoon communities online were going off the wall about Steven Universe. Though a while passed before I actually sat down and watched the show, this was the episode that made it really get my attention. I know some of you will be mad that this isn't higher up on the list, and believe me, it was tough to place it here. But just bear with me and you'll see what I have to say about the final 2 episodes. Number 2. Mr. Greg. Mr. Greg came to us towards the beginning of the Summer of Steven event, and man did they put their best foot forward. What's funny about Mr. Greg is that in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't actually do much to advance the plot of Steven Universe. There's no earth-shaking reveals or incredible revelations. This episode is all about the development of the relationship between Pearl and Greg and how Steven feels about it. Rather than a cornerstone of story development, it's instead a cornerstone of character development. On top of that, it's an episode that's almost entirely musical. Somehow it manages to pack an incredible 5 songs, 6 if you count a reprise, into an 11-minute segment. Music is one of the strong points of Steven Universe, and it really shows here. Not only that, but each of these songs is magnificently crafted, both lyrically and musically. Nothing else is quite as sublime as the stellar It's Over, Isn't It sequence, which remains one of the most beautiful sequences in Steven Universe, and, in my opinion, the history of animation. As much respect as I give to Adventure Time, the fact that Mr. Greg was nominated for an Emmy and yet didn't win was, in my opinion, a terrible injustice. Number 1. Reunited. I regret having to place Mr. Greg at number 2, because Reunited just barely manages to take its spot. Okay, I could go on for hours about how perfect everything about this episode is, and I may do that in another video soon, talking about every detail as to why this episode is so phenomenal. Some might accuse me of recency bias, because at the time of this video's production, Reunited is one of the most recent episodes. And they may not be entirely wrong, but for right now I can't imagine an episode this good will come along for quite a while. To put it simply, Reunited is the Infinity War of Steven Universe. Everything the show had been doing for the last few years was building to this. It has 2 of the most significant events in the show's history: the wedding of Ruby and Sapphire, and the fight and subsequent reconciliation with the Diamonds. Each of these is momentous in their own right, and I'll probably go into further detail about that when I do the expanded video on the subject. But for right now, Reunited is so excellent because it's the payoff that Steven Universe has been building to almost since its inception. That about does it for this list. Thanks for listening to what I have to say, and have a great day.